Hello. I don't tend to make very timely videos that are either that are when events are happening, because I am a chaos gremlin. What is time even? And because that's the way I run so much of my life, I don't really pay attention to timelines. I hadn't realized until really close to this video being posted that it was going to be posted on February the 14th, which is of course Valentine's Day. And I realized that I had this whole video ready to go for it. I realized actually what I really wanted to talk about was something that's relevant and timely to the fact that it's Valentine's Day. Even though in the grand scheme of things, I've never actually celebrated Valentine's Day. I celebrate chocolate goes on sale tomorrow day, which is where you go and pick up the cheap chocolate, discounted Valentine's chocolate that never got sold. Don't steal my holiday, but also feel free to steal my holiday. I did once buy my wife a singing snail, so it was like a little snail with a love heart shell, and it sang Can't Hurry Love by the Supremes, which then ended up becoming one of our wedding songs. But anyway, I realized it was going to be Valentine's Day, and something's going on in the author/book community right now that is relevant. And these two things have coincided with the fact that my wife is at a meeting for the next hour, and I therefore have time alone in the house to film a YouTube video. All of these things have conspired to allow me to actually make a timely YouTube video. So, without further ado, yes, here is my timely Valentine's-based YouTube video. There are lots of different ways to have romance in a book. So, I'm going to say that there are two sort of large umbrella categories. There is the romance genre category, which is a book is a romance book. The plot is the romance. And there is romance as a subplot, right? Which is where I tend to fall with my books. If you haven't been here before, I write books. That's what I do. Sci-fi and fantasy primarily. And you can find all the links in the description box below right next to the like and subscribe buttons if you feel like sticking around. Anyway, so the subgenre category is there is a plot to the book and there is a romantic subplot. Sometimes these things are interwoven and sometimes they could be completely divorced. Like if you took Mary Ellen Breaking the Curse, my first book, which is one I tend to use, for example, because it's my oldest. If you took the romance out of that, it would not affect the plot at all. It would a little bit affect the plot of book 2, but not a huge amount. You could take out the romance from that book and it wouldn't matter to the overarching plot of both of those books. Which is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. That's just a neutral fact. That's what a romantic subplot can look like. And a romantic subplot can be very intrinsically tied into the main plot, which is where you get to, and don't have come at me in the comments already because I'm about to talk about romantasy now. But that's where you get something like romantasy as a subgenre situation, which sort of straddles the boundary between a romance novel where the plot is the romance and a romantic subplot in a fantasy novel where there is the fantasy plot and a romantic subplot where the romantic subplot is so intrinsically linked with the main plot that you couldn't divorce it, but you also couldn't just lift out the fantasy plot and just make it be a romance novel. They're too interwoven. They are impossible to separate. Are you sitting in awe? My cat is sitting in my wife's desk chair. It's very sweet. And if I wasn't filming on my phone, I'd be taking photos. Anyway. So that's sort of by and large the overarching, how does romance work in novels, right? That's mostly context. We're going to dive into the more detailed aspect of it. From there, so romance, romantic subplot, romantasy. You also have, I like to imagine this next stage of this conversation as a lot of circles in a Venn diagram. There's a lot of overlap. I mean, honestly, I don't even think they're circles. I think they're sort of blobs that kind of interlink with one another. There's a lot of ways you can overlap these different things. There's a lot of movement between different types of romance, whether it be a romantic plot or a romantic subplot. And I'll be honest, I have obviously got more experience working with romantic subplots because it's what I write. So we're going to be mostly focusing on that because that's what my experience is in. But when it comes to writing romantic subplots, you have a couple of different ways to do it. I mean, when it comes to writing romance at all, you have a couple of different ways to do it. And so there are like broad categories that I think people tend to fall into, but those categories do have wibbly edges and they push up against each other a lot. Pun unintended, but definitely there. So you have anywhere from closed door through fade to black to explicit or detailed, right? And a lot of the time with explicit or detailed, people will call it smut or will call it spicy. But the thing is with the term spicy, smut and spicy are both terms that have been taken from the fanfiction community, right? And as a part of the fanfiction community, who's been a part of the fanfiction community for, more than half of my life, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I am saying that by commodifying these terms, sometimes they get a little bit like confused. So spicy in fanfiction and in most places where books are concerned means a type of smut, not an explicitness level. Whereas generally when people say smut, what they mean is it's explicitly described sex times. It's explicitly described. It happens on the page where the reader can read it, right? So when it comes to explicit or detailed smut, you tend to get things like the P word, the other P word. I think there's a third P word, the C word, the other C word. There's definitely another C word there. You know, you get explicit terms for genitalia is what I'm saying. You know where the hands are going. You know who's putting whose mouth where. You know what's potentially being inserted or rubbed up against. You know all of this stuff. Some examples of this could be Joy D'Amora's Hunger Pangs, or Kit Rusher's Consort of Fire are decent examples. Kit Rusher's Consort of Fire actually is a really great example of romantasy, like a completely interwoven, cannot separate the romance from the main plot because of the way that comes together. So like the main plot is to my mind, the main plot is Sachi is cursed. That's sort of all the revolutions around that. Sachi is cursed and has to kill the dragon. That's literally his name is the dragon. It's a title. And the romantic subplot is intrinsically linked to that because part of how she's going to kill the dragon, I don't know why I put all of that, kill the dragon, is by becoming his consort of fire. You see how this works. And therefore, the romantic plot that goes with Sachi and Zanya and Ash, the dragon, is so intrinsically linked because you couldn't remove it and still have the same story. You couldn't remove it and still have the curse and the consort and the whole situation. That's just not possible. So it's a great example of romantasy. It's also a great example of explicit sex scenes. It's very explicit. You know exactly what's where and when and how everyone feels about it. Shifting from that, and like that can be any, like you can go full on detail, all the words, or you can be a bit more like malleable with it. So like it's not like I've never written a smut scene. A, I write fanfiction. And B, not every fanfiction has smut. But B, I also write my short story scenes, although I am shifting probably over the next couple of years into more making the penny dreadfuls, which are the smutty ones. So I write these like specific smut mini stories that I sell at in-person events because nowhere will let me sell them online. And the thing with those is that it's very difficult, it turns out, to write a sex scene with a non-binary protagonist. Because when you're writing a sex scene with a non-binary protagonist, you have to find a way around describing what's going on. Well, you don't have to. I find that I have to figure out a way around describing what exactly is going on with secondary sex characteristics and primary sex characteristics, right? If I describe this body in too much detail, this character's body in too much detail, it can lead to people misgendering the character, right? And I'm not saying, like, non-binary bodies come in all shapes, sizes, and sorts, right? You can have all different kinds of non-binary bodies. And, like, that's not even touching on the idea, it's touching on the word to use in this video. That's not even addressing the knowledge that obviously intersex bodies also come in all kinds of varieties, and you don't have to be like non-binary and intersex at the same time, and you can be both of those things. They're two separate pieces of an identity, you know, like being intersex is a specific thing that is it's itself a thing, and then your gender identity is separate from that. And like you as an intersex person can hypothetically feel the link between these two elements of yourself, or they can be completely divorced. Like that's how gender and sexuality work. Although I suppose it's not sexuality even. We've not even touched on sexuality yet. Stop saying touched on. Anyway, the point is that when I was writing these smut scenes, I didn't want to describe the non-binary body because I didn't want of the character, because I didn't want it to be gendering, and I didn't want it to be a misgendering experience for a potential non-binary reader, and I didn't want it to be one of those moments, because I've had this before where I've written a non-binary character and then people start using the wrong pronouns for them. They just pick based on what the character does in the story, and it's like, I will be completely honest with you. For Nat, they pick he, and for Matter, they pick she, and I hate that because it's not fair. And it's like, I don't know if it's just that Nat has short hair and Matter has long hair. I don't know if it's because Nat is with these Navy guys, so like from context. I don't know if it's that Matter is this sweet, lovely person, or because they wear jumpsuits. I have no idea why people are doing this. I don't understand it. It's so annoying. But, so when I was writing these smutty zines, I decided I couldn't describe the body in too much detail, but I did want it to be explicit, right? And that's a very delicate line to walk, but it still lands it in the explicit camp before we get to the fade to black, right? And fade to black can look anything like what I do in my actual published books, like my short story zines are not published, what I do in the books you can buy anywhere. In my full-length novels, what I do in those is fade to black. So you have, in my case, this is sort of like a generic example of fade to black, of one type of fade to black. So one type of fade to black is where you have the start of the scene, and then the implication is there. You know what they're probably going to do next, but you don't get to see it, and you as the author, you as the reader, get to potentially fill in your imagination. So it's like, if you imagine it playing out on a stage. It's a good analogy, I promise. If you imagine it playing out on a stage, you're watching these two characters do things. Potentially there's a voiceover telling you how they feel, whatever. And then they start smooching away. Hands smooching. And somebody's hand goes up somebody's shirt, maybe. You know, like it can be anywhere from just the first kissing to like getting their pants off. Like anything can happen in that. And then the lights go down. And potentially you can still hear, this is the malleability of it. Potentially you can still hear the noises, or potentially you're sitting in the dark at the end of the scene and thinking, okay, well, I know what they're doing. Right, and by hear the noises, what I mean is sometimes when people do fade to black, they shift out of explicit detail and into emotional detail. So emotional detail looks like, honestly, I also do this. I think this one is a big one for unlicensed delivery. It happens a couple of times in there. But emotional detail is basically, instead of saying who's got what pieces going where, it's how does the perspective character in the scene feel about what's happening? Like, are they filled with love? Are they filled with pleasure? One would hope. Are they enjoying the sensations that are being provided to them? Do they feel like, so in Poison Study, I'm going to keep referencing other books. You don't have to read all of these books, but they are all books I recommend that I like and I enjoy. Poison Study by Maria V. Snyder has a fade to black scene in the first book. It also has them in the subsequent two books. Can't remember what happens thereafter, but it's a young adult series. So in the first book, they have a fade to black scene where it's clear that the two main characters, the main character and her love interest, are having sex. And in it, it's very metaphorical, poetic language, right? There's like, my blood ran in his veins and his heart pumped in, I don't remember. I don't know the scene by heart. Should probably have gathered these books before I started this. But yeah, like, it's a very poetic way of phrasing it. So it's still fade to black because you're not seeing what's happening. It's very emotive, but you do know what's happening, and it is happening on the page to an extent. I think that is super appropriate, by the way, for young adult books, because when I was a young adult age range reader, I definitely was reading books that were adult books and that were like explicit adult books. I was also reading fan fiction, which back in the day was not labelled very well because of the way that the fanfiction sites back then worked. And oh my gosh, AO3 is like a lifeline. By comparison, it's such a good site. If you ever want to dip your toe into fanfiction, AO3 is the best because you can filter the fics by how explicit they are, and I love that. Anyway, so I think it's really beautiful in a young adult book to have that, because I don't think that young adult protagonists should be not having sex, because lots of young adults do have sex. Lots of young adults are curious about sex. Lots of young adults are, it's a thing that matters and means something and is relevant to their lives. And I don't think that characters shouldn't be having sex, but I also don't necessarily think that explicit stuff is great for teens or appropriate for teens. So I think fade to black and that sort of soft line between fade to black and detail is a really neat space for young adult books. And I don't write young adult books, so I don't know why I'm going into so much detail about it. The next stage over from fade to black, because fade to black, like I said, can stop at kissing, and you can be there like, they're kissing, they're near a bed. You know what's going to happen, right? Okay, let's turn the lights out. But the other thing you can do is closed door. And I personally, this is a big no-go for me. Like, I am down to read the filthiest nonsense I've ever seen in my entire life. And like, I know if I'm not enjoying myself, there's an excellent thing to do about that, which is just, well, I didn't like that. And that's all that matters. Is like, either I just close the book, or if I want to finish the book, I just skip past the scene and I continue reading the plot part, right? Which I highly recommend doing that, by the way, if you find something you're uncomfortable with. But I land in the fade to black zone because it's what I find easiest to write. It's what I like writing the best. Like, I love writing my short story, my penny dreadfuls rather. Love writing my smutty short stories, but gosh, do I have to be in the right frame of mind to be able to do it, because it is a very tricky sort of scene to write. Like, people talk about how to write smut scenes, and there's loads of different pieces of advice, but in all honesty, the only thing I have ever found to work is I must be in exactly the right headspace for it. And you may be thinking, are you trying to tell me that you're feeling the feelings when you write? No, that's not the headspace. I've got to be in the really detail-oriented descriptive headspace, which is a very hard place for me to get to. So the detail-oriented descriptive headspace for me is very, very specifically the same headspace I use every time I want to do like a big set piece in a book. So like in Mary Ellen Finding the Air, the second in the Guardian Cadet series books, there's a big ball that happens in that. And I spent 3 different detail-oriented headspaces trying to describe that ball. It's that headspace that I have to use. Something that's a huge set piece and needs a lot of description and needs a lot of detail. Because that's the thing with smut. For me, when I write it, if I'm writing smut, it needs a lot of detail and it needs a lot of focus and it needs a lot of maintenance. Like, you have to maintain, you know exactly where their hands are, because if their hands are in the wrong place, then that's confusing. And how many hands do they have? And like, in a fight scene, there's a little bit more maneuverability there. If in 1 second they're holding onto somebody's wrist and the next second they're punching them in the face with that same hand, you can imagine as the reader that they just let go, right? When it comes to smut, it's not that simple. I know other people have to be in the fight scene headspace to be able to do it, and I know that other people also recommend that you are in the sexy headspace to write the sexy scenes. And all of these work for different types of people. So I'm not trying to give you like, this is the only advice that's going to work. I'm saying what works for me is this one, and here are some others I've heard. But when it comes to closed door, I don't like it because I find, and in my opinion, it tends to have a moralistic value placed upon it. So with fade to black, you don't know why someone's fading to black. They could be like me and just not be dealing with the detail involved in that. Or they could be like, I don't want to write this because I'm not personally comfortable. Or they could be like, hey, I know my readers don't enjoy that, so I'm not going to offer it to them. Or they could be like, you know, whatever. Whereas with closed door, it's a much more forceful ejection from the scene itself. So like, instead of it being like, oh, they're kissing near a bed, we all know what's going to happen now, right? It's sort of like, they're kissing near a bed, door closed, you don't get to see anymore. And I know that that's not the case for everyone. Not everyone sees it that way. Not everyone writes it that way. I'm not trying to make a generalization about it. I'm saying I personally, as a reader, feel that every time there's a closed door. So a lot of the time with closed door, it tends, and like obviously I have the least experience with this because it's the one that annoys me the most, and I tend to close the books. You close me out, I close your book. It tends to be the books that I don't finish have closed door. But with closed door, what you're getting is quite an abrupt end to the scene, right? That's how it's a closed door. So like sometimes you get the thing of like after the fact, you get the conversation about it. But again, I find that tends to be more common. In fade to black than it does in closed door. Because a lot of the time closed door is coming from the perspective of people who have some kind of, like I said, moralizing ideology about this. Whether it's, I don't want to write smut, that's filthy, or that's sorry, I can't take it seriously. I don't want to write smut, it's against my religion, which I don't get because I was raised non-religious, so I don't understand that feeling. Or I don't want to write smut because I feel like it's cheating on my partner, which I don't get because I don't have that at all, even a little bit. And I've heard someone say it, and it just sounds like nonsense. And I do wonder if that's still in some like religious context that I don't understand. I don't know, maybe. Either way, I'm not saying you shouldn't like closed door. I'm not saying you shouldn't write closed door. I'm saying I don't personally like it. Then we get into the next set of discussions. So we've reached the umbrellas of romance, romantic subplot, and romantasy. We've reached the wibbly wobbly scale of explicit through fade to black to closed door. And like, I'm not saying also, this is another point, you don't have to be in one camp for every single sex scene in any given book. Like, any given book can have a variety of these different things in it. Like, I've read books where, I think actually Hunger Pangs by Joy DeMora, Hunger Pangs True Love Bites by Joy DeMora actually has a really great example of this, where the first sex scene is in explicit detail. The second one is just referenced after the fact. The third one, it's a long book, by the way. The third one is, I think, is fade to black and then talked about again afterwards. So it's got this combo of different things going on in it. And you can absolutely have that in books. You can have all of them be fade to black. You can have some of them be fade to black. You can have all of them be in explicit detail. You can have some of them be in explicit detail. You can have some of it just referenced after. You know, these are all options and you're allowed to mix and match. Then we get into the next conversation, which is the sliding heat scale, basically. So anything from, this is where you get sweet to spicy radars going on. And I don't like, personally, I don't like that it's sweet to spicy, because the implication with that is that it cannot be both spicy and sweet at the same time. And if you've never had chili hot chocolate, you are missing out, because it's an experience. If nothing else, even if you don't like it, it is an experience. But the point is that sweet things can be spicy and spicy things can be sweet. And And I think that a sweet to spicy radar is doing us a disservice, because I'm actually going to pick Hunger Pangs again because it's actually a really great example of this. So in Hunger Pangs True Love Bites by Joy Tomorrow, they have kinky sex, right? That's a thing that happens in that book. I'm just having this brief moment of wondering, sometimes my mum watches these YouTube videos. It'll be fine. She'll either turn it off or she'll be fine about it. Those are the options. If you don't like it, there's a back button. Anyway, in Hunger Pangs True Love Bites by Joy Tomorrow, the first sex scene they have together, Nathan and Vlad have together, is a kinky one. They have this open discussion about kink before it starts. It's a really nice scene, honestly. And in that, it's a very, very sweet, kinky scene. But on the radar of sweet to spicy, it would land in the spicy zone, which again creates this whole moralistic value that I don't appreciate, and implies that you can't be sweet and spicy. But the actual, what it is meant to be describing, now that I've gone off on my tangent, what it's meant to be describing is basically spicy is, like I said, it's kinky times. It's a little bit, potentially a little bit rougher, potentially a little bit like harsher in a fun way, usually in a fun way. It's one of those things where it's like, oh, this is not just potentially explicit, it doesn't have to be, can be fade to black. We go into the above levels, but this is something that in real life, this is how I'm going to phrase it. This is something that in real life should be negotiated in advance. I don't think it always needs to have the negotiation in a book because, there's a level of fantasy involved here. And obviously that, again, my personal opinion. But I think that sometimes there's this push to have everyone have these really, especially after you've had some really, really bad spicy stuff come out. There's this push in healthy communities to be there maybe we should display what that looks like, display healthy conversations. But then sometimes that gets a bit much. Again, Hunger Pangs True Love Bites actually has an excellent discussion that happens beforehand. And it feels very organic to the characters and the way that the rest of the book works. So it's nice. Whereas the sweeter end of the spectrum is sort of essentially what happens in the Guardian Cadet series by me, Mary Ellen Breaking the Curse, Mary Ellen Finding the Air. More so in Mary Ellen Finding the Air, because Mary Ellen Breaking the Curse, there isn't much. It's all build up until the end of the book, and then the romance happens. But in the second book, obviously that romance continues. So in Mary Ellen Finding the Air, Mary is in her very first ever relationship. And her paramour, because I don't like the words boyfriend and girlfriend, her paramour is very aware of that and very intentionally keeping himself in check so that he doesn't accidentally push her too far or let her if I said let her enjoy anything too far, does that sound really bad? The point I'm trying to make is that in the he knows that in the moment one can get carried away and agree to things that one doesn't necessarily actually want to do, which is why in real life having conversations about the spicier end of the spectrum is really important, because in the moment you can agree to things because your brain is hopped up on dopamine and pleasure chemicals. You can agree to things because you're having a good time, whereas you might not actually in the cold light of day have wanted to do that. So the sweet end of the spectrum is this. Yes, the love interest is very much hey, this is for me a point of check-in. I want to make sure that you actually want to do this and not that you're thinking, this is fun, let's keep going. So they have a couple of those moments where he's hey, I love this. Can we not go any further right now so that you have time to think about this after the fact and you have time to decide if this is something you want to pursue? And that's why that's very sweet, because it's very, I guess it's very emotion-centered again, because that's the point of it, is that these two people are being sweet to each other. Most of the time it's quite not necessarily chaste, because again, it can be written, that can be explicit stuff. But it's not in my books, but it can be. But that's sort of the spectrum you're looking at, is is it going hardcore rough, and if you were doing this in reality, you should definitely have a conversation about it beforehand? Or is it like, hey, I really like you. I like doing this with you. This is nice. Just nice, like... And I don't want to say like standard stuff, because like obviously everybody's got different things that they like and that they don't like. And like in reality, everybody should have a conversation, in my humble opinion. But like, I get that it looks different for every different person and it feels different for every different person. But on the sweeter end of the spectrum, the expectation is that you're going to follow those, like, I guess traditional is a good word, traditional boundaries. You're going to have kissing, and you're going to have touching, and you're going to have melding of things that might meld. And you're going to, you know, be kind to each other in the moment. Whereas with the spicier end of the spectrum, I suppose it's, you don't have to appear kind to each other in the moment, even if you're all having a good time. That, I think, is pretty decently a primer for... I'm not about to come up with a whole new topic. Don't worry. I know I've done that before. That's not what's happening. That's a pretty decent primer for, like, how does romance and sex work in novels? I only know about novels. How does romance and sex work in novels? That's a pretty decent base level understanding, and you can do more research and look into it in greater detail if you want to. No pressure. So that leads us on to, why am I making this video now? Other than the fact that it's Valentine's Day, and I literally realised that today when I went to the pharmacy to pick up my medicine, and they were like, "Oh, happy Valentine's Day," and I was like, "Happy what? Oh my gosh." Luckily, my wife and I do not celebrate. I can't remember if I already said this. My wife and I don't celebrate Valentine's Day. We celebrate chocolate goes on sale on the 15th. And with that, and with the fact that there has been a publishing house lately who put, like, medium recently enough for it still to be a conversation, who put out a thing about hashtag, I think it was, sick of the smut hashtag, and went into detail about how that's never going to happen in their books. They're never going to do anything explicit because they're sick of seeing smut in books. And it's like, okay. That's an unreasonable stance to take, because the way to take that stance reasonably, I do think there is a reasonable way to take the I am sick of seeing smut in books stance. I think there is a reasonable way to do this, which is stop penalising authors, especially indie authors, but authors in general, for writing explicit stuff. Because by penalising people have to find workarounds. They actually have a great example of this in real life. So, some time ago, I don't know how long, some time ago, the big fanfiction website was not Archive of Our Own. Some time ago, the big fanfiction website was fanfiction.net. Fanfiction.net was advertiser funded. The trouble with being advertiser funded is that the advertisers get to have a say in what happens where it is, which is why, like, there's a whole conversation around TV licensing with the BBC versus, like, advertising-based TV channels like Channel 4 or ITV or Channel 5. These are British TV channels. Just roll with it. So the trouble with, I mean, there's trouble with all of the TV channels. But anyway, the trouble with fanfiction.net was that it started out having the same kinds of ratings that AO3 has now. So it had general audiences, I don't know what they actually called it, so I'll just use the AO3 terms. General audiences, teen and up, mature and explicit. And then there's also unrated on AO3, but I don't know if fanfiction.net ever had that. But those were basically the 4 age ranges or explicitity ratings that you had on fanfiction.net. General audiences, teen and up, which is like essentially a 12A, mature, which is essentially a 15, and explicit, which is essentially an 18, if you're looking for equivalencies. So, maybe you live in a 13 plus place instead of 12A. Anyway, that's not important. So, when it comes to those ratings, that was being used, and we all had our fanfiction terms. Does anyone remember the days of lemons and limes? But then advertisers got grumpy and they wanted fanfiction.net to get rid of the explicit stuff. So fanfiction.net got rid of the explicit tier. And the thing is that doesn't actually stop people writing explicit stories and posting them to fanfiction.net. What it does is it clogs the mature filter with all of these explicit ratings, and you have to find a workaround, a slang term, a way to communicate to people, to readers, that this contains explicit material without communicating to advertisers or communicating to the site itself that this contains explicit material. And therein lies a lot of the problem we're having now, where people are finding books, they're looking at these books and they're thinking, ooh, this looks like a good book. And then they're reading it, they're finding explicit smut, and they're like, man, I wish I had known that before I bought it, because it's just not my jam, right? And that's completely fair. We all have preferences. But the trouble is, the reason that this is happening is because a lot of places, including a large conglomerate that shall remain unnamed, that may or may not share a title with a forest and a river, penalizes people for having their books labeled as having explicit content. Not always, but enough that it's become a thing that one as an indie author needs to work around. And there are slang ways of communicating. There are like the pieces of insider knowledge to be able to communicate, like, hey, by the way, this has explicit stuff. Hey, by the way, check out my website if you want more details about that. But the thing is not everybody knows that stuff, because not everybody can know that stuff. Sometimes when you're a foolish teenager, you click on the thing labeled lemon because you don't really know what lemon means. It means sex. Explicit sex. Whoopsies. Back button. Or maybe you read it. I don't know. But the point is that those workarounds are kind of okay in a community area like fanfiction, because fanfiction is, things are shifting and changing in a bad way, but fanfiction has usually and historically been built around these communities. So it's easy to communicate within your community that this is a thing that you need to be aware of. But it's not necessarily a fair assumption that everybody within book reading spheres would be within those communities and would be able to know that that's what that means. And even then, if it's within the explicit reading community and you are a person trying to avoid that, you're not going to be hearing that piece of information. So really, what needs to happen if you are A, sick of the smut, or B, desperately looking for smut, is both sets of people in this like apparent argument that exists somewhere on the internet that I'll admit, purposefully say I'm not interested in every time it comes up, because I'm not interested. I've been in fandom for a long time. You learn that these arguments are petty after a while. But both sets of these people, what they actually need is to have stuff that's more clearly tagged. We need a way to communicate on the blurb page, on the back cover, somewhere easy to access that everybody can see, whether this is something that is fade to black or closed door or explicitly detailed. And we need to have it be something that's easy for authors to access, easy for readers to understand, and isn't going to get anybody penalized for having decided to reach for that specific rating. If you're going to get penalized for writing an explicit book or reading an explicit book, then this system cannot work. And people are still constantly and consistently going to come up against the problem that they don't want to read the thing that they're reading, or they can't find the thing that they want to read, or like you can't publish the thing you want to publish because somebody somewhere got the squicks about it. And it's like, I know I'm not unaware of what's happening in the world. And you may be thinking this is a really like low-level problem in the grand scheme of everything that's going on, but it's actually not, because this is also a conversation to be had around book banning. I'm not saying that banning queer children's books is the same thing as banning explicit books from adult spaces. I'm saying that the people making these things happen are the same people, right? That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that the people who don't want explicit content in books are the same people who don't want queer or queer topics, immigration topics, race-based topics, historical understanding of topics, or, actual, real, natural phenomenon like two male penguins raising an egg to exist in children's books. It's the same people. And those are the same people that are taking books like mine, which are fade to black with nothing explicit and nothing nefarious. I'm not saying that explicit stuff is nefarious. Obviously, I've just said I like it. Books like mine, and thinking, I don't want to stock that on my shelf. I don't want that to be stocked on my local bookshelf because the main character is non-binary. When I was at an event in 2024, I'm not going to name which event because it's not the event's fault. When I was at an event in 2024, I had a giant inclusive pride flag. I lost my banners. But either way, whatever event I've ever been to, I have had either a layer of mini flag banners, including the inclusive pride flag, and most of the time including the disability flag, because those are two things that are relevant, because all of my books have queer and disabled characters in them, because we deserve to go on quests and explore space too. But I've always got the inclusive pride flag on my table somewhere, whether it's a giant flag after I lost my mini banners or the mini banners. I've always got an inclusive pride flag. I don't know how that hasn't scared the people off that don't want to read queer books. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people see that and they don't really know what it means. So they just come over and they pick up a book and they turn it over. And especially if it's one of my pirate books, they turn it over, they see the they, them on the back cover and they panic and they don't know how to leave. Or worse, they panic and they get aggressive with me or with my wife, who's usually at the table with me, for having a book like that available on a table to sell at an event where people are selling books. And I've never been threatened and I'm fine. And I'm not upset on a personal level. Like these people telling me that they think I'm horrible or whatever. I'm not gonna list terms. It's people saying these things to me about my books. It doesn't upset me. It's frustrating because I'm like, you could just leave. Like you're blocking table space for people who do actually want to read this stuff. But it's the same kind of feeling I get when I find out that people can't have their name. Like when I sign books at events or when you buy books from me, I ask if there's a name that you want me to sign them to. So I'll sign my name at the bottom and I'll ask if there's a name you want me to sign them to. And I can't promise I'll spell it right, even if you spell it for me. Or write it down and I copy it because I have dyslexia and sometimes letters morph from my eye to my hand. But I ask if there's a name people want me to sign it to. And a lot of the time people say, I can't because it's too risky. And that's the same feeling for me as being told off for having written that book in the first place. And it's I'm just kind of sad that people get this up in arms about it. And whether that is at me or the risk of the person buying the book, it fucking sucks, man. And I think that we need to be able to have these conversations around what level of explicitness, what level of spice, what level of romance people want in books without trying to ascribe any kind of moral judgment to it, because there is nothing to be ascribed. People like reading smutty things and some people don't like reading smutty things. Some people like it from a very asexual perspective, whether they are asexual or not. A lot of people read smutty books and they don't feel anything inside their bodies because of it. Other people read them because they make them feel good. And again, some of those people are asexual. Like, there's so many different ways to interact with this kind of media, and I don't think any of them is the wrong way, unless you are defacing a library book, in which case I think that's a little rude. But I also think that about people who've used cheese singles as bookmarks. Not appropriate. So, yeah, happy Valentine's Day! Remember, if you want to buy any of my books, which are Fade to Black, or you want to inquire as to where exactly one might get one's hands on smutty pirate penny dreadfuls, all the links you need to find me are in the description box below, right next to the like and subscribe button. As always, surprisingly enough, videos like these are not monetized. My channel is not currently monetized, so if you want to financially support me, buying my books is the best step, but there is always a link to my Ko-fi account in the description below if my books are just not your vibe. I get that. We all have preferences. I will see you in 2 weeks' time, either with the video that I was gonna post today or something completely different, because apparently I'm taking things very chaotically this year. Who's surprised? Because I'm certainly not. Bye!